Hey guys, tonight we begin with trade. Very civilized trade, the kind that involves addiction, gunboats, and politely explaining destruction as free commerce. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from. Around the world now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, a world within itself. At the dawn of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty stood at the pinnacle of its power, ruling over a civilization that it considered absolute and complete. It was not an emerging or developing nation. In the eyes of its rulers and people, China was a perfectly written book, with no need for a sequel. It was vast, incredibly wealthy, and meticulously orderly. From the imperial court in Beijing, the world made perfect sense. China sat firmly at the center of civilization, known as the Middle Kingdom. To them, everything beyond their borders existed in a state of cultural confusion. Europe, from this perspective, was nothing more than a distant land, populated by noisy merchants with odd clothing choices and an unhealthy, almost strange obsession with boats. China had every reason to be confident. The empire successfully fed hundreds of millions of people, and its bureaucracy functioned with a terrifyingly efficient consistency. While other nations struggled with internal strife, China's scholars spent their entire lives memorizing classical texts that were older than most European capitals. In this society, examinations, not sword fights, decided one's career and future. This put China several centuries ahead of the rest of the world in terms of workplace professionalism and meritocracy. Most importantly, China produced the very things that the rest of the world craved. Their tea fueled Europe's mornings, their silk-wrapped aristocrats in status, and their fine porcelain sat delicately on tables across the globe. It was a world where people in distant lands would argue loudly about philosophy while sipping Chinese beverages out of Chinese cups. However, this story of civilized trade was about to face a dark turn. Beneath the surface of peaceful commerce, elements of addiction, gunboats, and destruction were beginning to stir. The era of isolation and supreme confidence was about to be challenged by a world that refused to remain outside the borders of the Middle Kingdom. The peace of the Middle Kingdom was anchored in a simple, one-sided reality. The world needed China, but China needed nothing from the world. For decades, the British and other European powers had been forced to pay for tea, silk, and porcelain with silver, as the Chinese emperors saw no value in European manufactured goods. This created a massive trade deficit that the Western merchants were desperate to fix. The solution they found was as clever as it was devastating: opium. By smuggling vast quantities of this highly addictive drug into Chinese ports from British-controlled India, the merchants finally found something the Chinese people would buy. Slowly, the flow of silver reversed. The unhealthy obsession with boats that the Chinese once mocked now became a looming threat. These were no longer just merchant vessels. They were gunboats, armed with technology the Qing bureaucracy had long ignored. As addiction spread through the streets and even into the imperial administration, the perfectly written book of Chinese civilization began to see its pages torn. The emperor's attempts to ban the drug and burn the crates of opium led to a direct confrontation with the British Empire. This marked the end of the era of civilized trade and the beginning of the Opium Wars. The walls of the Forbidden City, which for centuries felt like the center of an unshakable universe, were now vulnerable. The scholars who had memorized ancient texts found no answers in them for the steam-powered engines and heavy cannons of the West. The Middle Kingdom was about to learn a harsh lesson. The world beyond its borders was no longer in cultural confusion. It was organized, aggressive, and knocking at the door with a force that would change China forever. The collision between the Middle Kingdom and the Western powers was more than just a military defeat. It was a profound psychological shock. For a civilization that believed it had figured everything out centuries ago. The sight of British ironclad steamships, the Nemesis sailing up the Yangtze River, was like an invasion from another planet. The Qing officials, who had once viewed European merchants as barbarians in odd clothing, were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. This was the first of what China would later call the unequal treaties. The terms were a humiliating wake-up call. Hong Kong was ceded to the British. 5 treaty ports were forced open for unrestricted trade. China had to pay a massive silver indemnity to cover the cost of the very opium the British had brought to their shores. The terrifying consistency of the Chinese bureaucracy began to crumble under the weight of internal rebellion and external pressure. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, soon erupted from within, fueled by the social and economic chaos the wars had triggered. The scholars who had spent their lives memorizing ancient texts now realized that their traditional knowledge could not stop a bullet or command a steam engine. By the late 19th century, the perfectly written Book of China was being forcefully rewritten. The empire began a desperate self-strengthening movement, trying to adopt Western technology while clinging to Confucian values. They built shipyards, translated science books, and sent students abroad, but the old world of the Qing was fading. The story of the 19th century ended not with the completion of a civilization, but with its painful transformation. The Middle Kingdom was no longer the sole center of the universe. It was now a player in a volatile, interconnected, and often violent global game. The receipts China once held were gone, replaced by a long, difficult road toward a new identity in the modern world. As the 20th century approached, the Qing dynasty found itself trapped between its glorious past and a relentless future. The perfectly written book was now filled with stains of conflict. The Boxer Rebellion at the turn of the century was a final, desperate gasp of traditionalism and attempt to drive out foreign influence through martial arts and ancient beliefs. But it failed against the industrialized weapons of the Eight-Nation Alliance, leaving Beijing occupied and the imperial court in flight. The receipts that the narrator mentioned at the beginning of the journey, the silk, and the silver, were no longer enough to sustain an empire that refused to modernize its soul. In 1911, the inevitable finally happened. The Xinhai Revolution broke out, and the thousands of years-old imperial system collapsed almost overnight. The last emperor, a mere child named Pui, abdicated his throne, bringing an end to the Middle Kingdom as the world had known it for millennia. China transitioned from an empire to a republic, but the road was anything but smooth. The country fell into a period of warlordism, where local generals fought over the fragments of the fallen dynasty. The orderly and deeply convinced civilization was replaced by a chaotic search for a new identity. However, the story does not end in tragedy. From the ashes of the Qing dynasty, a new kind of China began to emerge. The obsession with memorizing ancient texts was replaced by a hunger for modern science, engineering, and global politics. The noisy merchants from the West were no longer just outsiders. Their ideas, for better or worse, had become part of a new global dialogue. The journey that began with tea and porcelain ended with a total transformation of the human experience. China learned that to survive in a world of gunboats and steam engines, it had to stop looking backward at its completed history and start writing a new, unwritten chapter. The Middle Kingdom was no longer the center of a static world, but a dynamic power in a rapidly changing one. The journey that began with tea and porcelain ended with a total transformation of the human experience. China learned that to survive in a world of gunboats and steam engines, it had to stop looking backward at its completed history and start writing a new, unwritten chapter. The Middle Kingdom was no longer the center of a static world, but a dynamic power in a rapidly changing one. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912 wasn't just the end of a family's rule. It was the death of a 2,000-year-old idea. The Middle Kingdom, which once believed it was the finished and perfect center of the universe, now found itself at a crossroads of fire and blood. For decades, China suffered through foreign invasions and internal struggles. The unhealthy obsession with boats that the British once showed had evolved into a world of airplanes, tanks, and global wars. But in this chaos, a new spirit was born. The Chinese people, who once spent lifetimes memorizing ancient texts, began to master the languages of modern science, industry, and revolution. By the mid-20th century, the completed civilization had reinvented itself. The walls of the Forbidden City remained as a museum, but the power moved to the hands of a new generation. China didn't just join the modern world, it began to lead it. The country that once looked down on noisy merchants became the world's factory, once again producing the things everyone wanted, not just tea and silk, but technology that reached every corner of the planet. The story comes full circle. Today, China is no longer a perfectly written book with no sequel. Instead, it is a dynamic, ever-changing superpower. It learned the hardest lesson history can teach, that no civilization is ever finished. To survive, one must always be willing to learn, to adapt, and to grow. The story of the Middle Kingdom did not end with the fall of the Qing or the struggles of the 20th century. Instead, it transformed into one of the greatest economic and social resurrections in human history. Today, the receipts of China have returned in a digital and industrial form. The empire that once prided itself on porcelain and silk now dominates the world of high-speed rail, artificial intelligence, and green energy. The scholars of today no longer memorize ancient texts for bureaucracy. Instead, millions of engineers and scientists work to push the boundaries of space exploration and quantum computing. However, the lessons of the 19th century remain etched in the nation's memory. The century of humiliation, that period when gunboats and opium broke the empire's peace, serves as a constant reminder that isolation and stagnation lead to vulnerability. This history drives China's current ambition to never again be left behind by the tide of global technology. But as the new Middle Kingdom stands at the center of the global stage, it faces a different set of questions. How will it balance its ancient traditions with its modern power? Can it maintain its internal order while navigating a world that is more interconnected and volatile than ever before? The perfectly written book that the Qing dynasty once believed in has been replaced by a living, breathing history that is being written every single day. China has proven that a civilization is never truly finished. It is a constant process of death, rebirth, and evolution. The journey from the tea-filled cups of the 1800s to the silicon chips of the 2020s is a testament to the resilience of a people who refuse to let their story end.